October 2023, Camp Pendleton. A Marine sniper unit was failing their qualification test so badly that their entire deployment was at risk, missing targets that should have been routine hits. Then a quiet, 68-year-old Navy veteran showed up at the range, picked up a rifle he hadn't touched in decades, and made a shot that left everyone speechless. What did this old sailor know that an entire team of elite Marine snipers had somehow forgotten? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun blazed over the desert rifle range at Camp Pendleton, California, casting long shadows across the dirt berms and target stations. Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway stood behind his scope, sweat beading on his forehead despite the early hour. The crosshairs danced over the target 800 yards downrange, a distance he'd made successfully hundreds of times before. He controlled his breathing, felt the rhythm of his heartbeat, squeezed the trigger with practiced precision. The shot cracked across the valley. Downrange, the spotter's voice came through crackling and flat over the radio. "Miss, low and right, 2 feet." Marcus exhaled slowly, frustration building in his chest. That made 6 misses in a row. Around him, the rest of Scout Sniper Team 3 was faring no better. The sound of rifles echoed across the range, but the call-outs from the spotters told the same story again and again. Miss, miss, miss. Captain Jennifer Reeves lowered her binoculars, her jaw tight. She'd commanded sniper platoons for 8 years, had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, where her teams had performed flawlessly under pressure. But what she was witnessing now defied explanation. Her Marines, highly trained, experienced shooters, were failing at a level she'd never seen before. "Cease fire," she called out, her voice cutting through the morning air. "Everyone off the line. Weapons safe." The team of 12 snipers stepped back from their positions, exchanging confused glances. These weren't rookies. Corporal Danny Chen had made a confirmed kill at 200 yards in Helmand Province. Sergeant First Class Robert Mitchell had graduated top of his sniper school class. Lance Corporal Sarah Brennan had qualified expert marksman 3 years running. Yet here they were, missing targets at ranges that should have been well within their capabilities. Marcus approached the captain, his rifle slung across his chest. "Ma'am, I don't understand what's happening. My fundamentals are solid. Breathing's controlled, trigger squeeze is smooth. I'm reading the wind correctly." "I know, Holloway," Captain Reeves interrupted, rubbing her temples. "It's not just you, it's everyone." She pulled out her tablet and pulled up the morning's scores. The numbers painted a grim picture. The unit's collective hit rate was hovering at 32%, barely above random chance. For a Marine Scout sniper team, it was catastrophic. Their deployment to the Middle East was scheduled for 6 weeks out, and at this rate, they'd be grounded before they ever left California. "Listen up," Captain Reeves called to the assembled team. "We're taking a 15-minute break. Hydrate, check your equipment, and when we resume, I want complete focus. We figure this out today." As the Marines dispersed toward the shade of a camouflage netting, Corporal Chen approached Sergeant Mitchell. "This doesn't make sense, Mitch. I cleaned my rifle last night, checked the scope mounting, verified the 0 at 100 yards. Everything's perfect on paper." Mitchell shook his head, his weathered face creased with worry. "Same here. I've been shooting since I was 10 years old. My grandfather taught me on an old bolt action in the woods of Montana. I know when something's off with my gear, and I'm telling you, the gear's fine." Sarah Brennan joined them, pulling off her shooting glove. "What if it's the ammunition? Bad batch, maybe?" "Already thought of that," Mitchell replied. "We're shooting from 3 different lot numbers. Can't all be bad." Captain Reeves overheard the conversation as she passed. She'd been wondering the same things, running through every variable she could think of. Environmental factors. The temperature was mild, winds were light and consistent, nothing unusual. Equipment failure? Each rifle had been inspected by the armorer that morning. Optics had been verified. Even the ammunition had been tested. The previous week had been just as bad. And the week before that, what had started as an anomaly, a single bad day that everyone figured was just an off performance, had stretched into 3 weeks of consistently poor results. The unit's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Barker, had already made 2 visits to the range, his expressions growing darker each time. This morning, before the sun had even risen, Captain Reeves had received an email that made her stomach drop. The subject line read, "Deployment status, urgent review required." The message was brief and bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. If the unit couldn't demonstrate significant improvement within 72 hours, their deployment would be cancelled and the team would be dissolved. Marines would be reassigned. Careers would be impacted. The unit that had built its reputation over 15 years of distinguished service would effectively cease to exist. She couldn't let that happen, but she was running out of ideas. Marcus sat in the shade, disassembling and reassembling his rifle's bolt mechanism for the 3rd time that morning, searching for any imperfection he might have missed. His hands moved with automatic precision, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about his father, a Marine sniper who'd served in the Gulf War. Growing up, he'd heard countless stories about the precision, the patience, the almost meditative focus required for long-range shooting. His father had made it sound like a craft, an art form. Marcus had followed in those footsteps with pride, had earned his scout sniper designation, had successfully completed missions that required split-second accuracy under combat stress. So why couldn't he hit a stationary target on a calm California morning? "All right, back on the line." Captain Reeves's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Let's try this again. I want everyone to slow down. Forget about speed, forget about your scores. Just focus on each individual shot. Breath control, sight picture, trigger press. Back to basics." The team returned to their positions. Marcus settled in behind his rifle, the familiar weight of the weapon pressed against his shoulder. He acquired the target through his scope, a simple silhouette at 800 yards. The image was crisp, clear. He noted the wind flags barely moving. No mirage distortion. Perfect conditions. He slowed his breathing, found the natural pause between breaths, placed the crosshair's center mass on the target, applied slow, steady pressure to the trigger, increasing until, crack, the rifle recoiled against his shoulder. Through the scope, he watched for impact. "Miss," came the spotter's voice. "Left 1 foot high, 6 inches." Marcus closed his eyes. The frustration was giving way to something worse, doubt. The kind of doubt that gets into a shooter's head and refuses to leave. The kind that makes you second-guess every decision, every movement. Around him, the morning continued in the same pattern. Shots fired, misses called. Occasionally someone would connect, but the ratio remained stubbornly, impossibly low. By noon, when Captain Reeves finally called an end to the session, the team's combined success rate had actually dropped to 29%. The Marines packed their gear in silence, the usual banter and camaraderie noticeably absent. They loaded into transport vehicles for the ride back to the main base, each lost in their own thoughts. Captain Reeves remained at the range after they'd gone, standing alone in the empty firing positions. She looked downrange at the targets, then back at the shooting line. Somewhere in this equation there was an answer. There had to be, but for the life of her she couldn't see it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lieutenant Colonel Barker. "Report to my office 0800 tomorrow. Bring solutions." She had less than 24 hours to figure out what was wrong with her team. 24 hours to save their deployment, their unit, possibly their careers. The sun was beginning its descent toward the Pacific, painting the California hills in shades of orange and gold. In that golden light, Captain Reeves made a decision. She'd spent 3 weeks looking at the technical side, equipment, ammunition, environmental factors. Maybe she'd been looking in the wrong place entirely. Maybe the problem wasn't with the gear at all. Captain Reeves sat in her office that evening, surrounded by manuals, ballistics charts, and training reports spread across her desk. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed as she pored over every detail from the past 3 weeks, searching for patterns she might have missed. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago. Outside her window, the base had quieted down for the night, but sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. She pulled up the individual shooter profiles on her computer, examining each Marine's performance history. Every single one of them had exemplary records. Chen had competed in the Marine Corps division matches and placed in the top 10. Mitchell had served as a sniper instructor for 2 years. Brennan had the steadiest hands she'd ever seen. What could cause an entire team of elite shooters to suddenly lose their ability? She clicked through to the medical records, wondering if there was some environmental factor she'd overlooked. Had there been a chemical exposure? Some kind of neurological issue affecting the whole unit? But the last medical evaluations had been routine. Everyone was in peak physical condition. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed Master Gunnery Sergeant Tom Whitfield, the base's senior sniper instructor. She'd sent him an email earlier that afternoon, asking if he'd ever encountered anything similar. "Captain Reeves," she answered. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "Ma'am, I got your message." Whitfield's gravelly voice came through. "I've been thinking about your situation all evening. In 30 years of training snipers, I've never seen anything quite like what you're describing. That's what I was afraid of." "Gunny." But Whitfield continued, "There was something odd that happened about 20 years back. Different circumstances, but have you checked when your team last did cold bore shots?" Captain Reeves frowned. "Cold bore shots, the first shot fired from a clean, cold barrel. We do them during qualifications, standard protocol." "Why?" "Just a thought. Sometimes, when teams get too comfortable with their routine, they develop habits that work fine 90% of the time, but fall apart under specific conditions. Has anyone from outside the unit observed them shooting?" "Just me and the range cadre. Might be worth getting fresh eyes on it. Someone who can watch without any preconceptions about what they should be seeing." After thanking Whitfield and ending the call, Captain Reeves leaned back in her chair. Fresh eyes. The phrase stuck with her. Everyone who'd watched her team shoot had been Marine snipers themselves. People trained in the same system, using the same doctrine. What if they were all missing something because they were too close to it? She grabbed her phone and started scrolling through her contacts, looking for someone, anyone, who might offer a different perspective. Her thumb paused over a name she hadn't thought about in months: Frank Dietrich. Frank was a retired Navy veteran who lived about 40 minutes from the base. They'd met 2 years ago at a joint service ceremony, and he'd mentioned he'd been involved in some kind of specialized shooting program during his service in the 1970s. She'd never followed up on the details, but he'd given her his number and told her to call if she ever needed anything. It was past 9 o'clock. Late to be calling, but desperation overrode etiquette. She dialed. The phone rang 4 times before a cautious voice answered. "Hello? Mr. Dietrich? This is Captain Jennifer Reeves, U.S. Marine Corps. We met at the Veterans Day ceremony at Pendleton a while back. I apologize for calling so late." There was a pause, then recognition in his voice. "Captain Reeves, of course. No apology necessary. What can I do for you?" She hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish. What was she going to say? That she was calling a retired sailor because her Marine snipers couldn't shoot straight? But the 72-hour deadline loomed, and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Sir, I have an unusual situation, and I'm hoping you might be willing to offer some insight. You mentioned you'd worked with precision shooting during your service. Would you be available to observe my sniper team at the range tomorrow morning?" Another pause.
"What kind of problem are we talking about?"
Captain Reeves gave him a brief overview. The inexplicable miss rate, the failed troubleshooting, the looming deadline. As she spoke, she could hear something shift in his tone, a sharpening of attention. "What time tomorrow?" he asked when she finished. "We'll be on the range at 0700. I'll be there at 0630. The next morning arrived with a marine layer of fog rolling in from the Pacific, giving the base an ethereal quality. Captain Reeves arrived at the range at 0600 to find Frank Dietrich already waiting by the gate, standing next to an old Ford pickup truck. He was not what she'd expected. At 68 years old, Frank had the lean, weathered build of someone who'd spent a lifetime staying active. His grey hair was cut military short, and his posture was ramrod straight despite his age. But it was his eyes that struck her. Sharp, observant, taking in every detail of the range, even from the parking area. "Mr. Dietrich, thank you for coming," she said, extending her hand. His grip was firm. "Call me Frank, Captain. And thank you for reaching out. I haven't been on a military range in about 15 years. Can I ask what your specialty was in the Navy?" A slight smile crossed his face. "I was a corpsman assigned to SEAL teams in Vietnam. And later, I worked with a research unit at Dahlgren Naval Proving Ground. We did a lot of experimental work with long-range shooting systems. Learned things that never made it into the standard manuals." Captain Reeves felt a flicker of hope. "My team arrives in 30 minutes. Would you like to see the range setup while we wait?" Frank nodded and followed her through the gate. As they walked down the firing line, his eyes scanned everything: the shooting positions, the target array downrange, the wind flags, the terrain. He paused at one of the shooting benches, running his hand along the sandbag rest. "Tell me about the positions they're shooting from," he said. "Standard prone position, supported by sandbags and bipods. Nothing unusual. And the targets? 800 yards, standard IPSC silhouettes. Some at 600, a few at 1,000 for the advanced shooters." Frank walked to the edge of the firing line and looked downrange, his gaze lingering on something Captain Reeves couldn't identify. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and jotted down a few notes. "In your email, you mentioned this started about 3 weeks ago. Did anything change on the range around that time? Any maintenance, modifications to the positions, changes in the target setup?" Captain Reeves thought back. "Actually, yes. We had the berms reshaped and added some new target stands. The base received funding for range improvements. Show me where the old positions were." She led him to an area about 15 feet to the left of the current firing line, where faded paint marks still indicated the previous setup. Frank stood in the old position, then walked to the new one, repeating this several times. Each time he'd stop and look downrange, as if calculating something in his head. "Interesting," he murmured. "What is it?" Before he could answer, the rumble of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of her team. Frank stepped back, becoming almost invisible near the equipment shed. Just another observer among the range staff. The Marines dismounted and began their pre-shoot routine: weapon inspection, equipment check, target verification. Captain Reeves gathered them for a brief before taking their positions. "Listen up," she said. "We have a guest observer today. Mr. Dietrich is a Navy veteran with specialized shooting experience. He's here to offer a fresh perspective on our performance. I expect full professionalism and focus." "Understood." A chorus of "Yes, ma'am" echoed across the line. Marcus noticed the older man standing near the shed, arms folded, watching with an intensity that felt different from typical range observers. There was something about the way he held himself, the way his eyes tracked every movement, that commanded respect. "All right," Captain Reeves called out. "Take your positions. Today we're running the same drill as yesterday, 10 rounds each at 800 yards. Let's see if we can improve on yesterday's numbers." The Marines settled into their shooting positions. Marcus adjusted his sandbags, checked his scope, and acquired his target. The fog had burned off, leaving perfect visibility. Light winds from the west, maybe 5 miles per hour. He made his elevation and windage adjustments, settled into his breathing pattern. From his position near the shed, Frank Dietrich watched. But he wasn't watching the targets downrange. His eyes were fixed on the shooters themselves, studying their body positions, the angle of their rifles, the way they settled into their aim. And in those first few moments of observation he saw it. The answer had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. The first shot of the morning cracked across the range. Frank's eyes narrowed as he watched Marcus Holloway behind his rifle, noting the subtle recoil, the follow-through, the way the Marine's body absorbed the shot. "Downrange?" The spotter's voice came through the radio with the now familiar result. "Miss right, 18 inches. Frank pulled out his notebook and sketched a quick diagram. He moved closer to the firing line, positioning himself where he could observe from a different angle. Sarah Brennan was next, her breathing controlled, her form textbook perfect. The rifle barked, and Frank watched the barrel's movement in that split second of recoil, miss low 2 feet. Captain Reeves stood beside Frank, her frustration barely contained. "You're seeing the same thing I am. Perfect form, proper fundamentals, and they're still missing." Frank didn't respond immediately. He was counting something in his head, his fingers tapping against his notebook. After watching 3 more shooters fire with similar results, he finally spoke. "Captain, may I ask you to do something that might seem strange? At this point, I'm willing to try anything. Have one of your shooters, doesn't matter who, set up in the old firing position. The one that was here before the range modification." Captain Reeves frowned, but nodded. "Holloway, grab your gear and move to the position 15 feet to your left, where those old paint marks are." Marcus looked confused but complied, dragging his mat and equipment to the indicated spot. He settled in, adjusted his position, and acquired his target through the scope. Something felt different, though he couldn't immediately identify what. The angle seemed slightly changed, the sight picture marginally altered. "Send one downrange," Captain Reeves called. Marcus went through his routine: breath control, sight alignment, trigger press. The shot broke clean. Through the spotting scope, the range observer's voice came through with surprise: "Hit, center mass." A murmur ran through the other Marines on the line. Marcus looked at his rifle as if it had betrayed him, then back at Captain Reeves, with confusion written across his face. "Again," Frank said quietly. "Have him shoot 4 more times from that position." Marcus fired 4 more rounds. 4 more hits, each within a 6-inch group at 800 yards, exactly the performance level expected from a Marine scout sniper. Captain Reeves turned to Frank, her eyes wide. "What just happened?" "May I?" Frank gestured toward the firing line. At her nod, he walked to where Marcus had been originally positioned, then to where he'd just successfully engaged the target. He knelt at both positions, sighting downrange without a weapon, just using his thumb and eye to measure angles. The Marines had gathered closer now, their shooting temporarily forgotten. All attention focused on the old Navy veteran who'd apparently just solved their 3-week mystery with a simple position change. Frank stood and walked back to Captain Reeves. When they reshaped the berms and moved the firing line, they shifted the shooting positions approximately 15 feet to the right and elevated them by about 8 inches. Small changes, barely noticeable to someone walking the range. But those changes altered the angular relationship between the shooting position and the targets. "I don't understand," Captain Reeves said. "We compensated for the new distances. We re-zeroed all the weapons from the new positions. You zeroed at what distance?" 100 yards, standard procedure." Frank nodded as if this confirmed something. "That's the problem. At 100 yards, the angular difference is negligible. So small, it doesn't show up during zeroing. But that tiny angle magnifies exponentially as the distance increases. By the time the bullet travels 800 yards, that slight angular discrepancy translates to multiple feet of deviation." He pulled out his notebook and drew a diagram. 2 lines starting nearly parallel but slowly diverging. "This is a phenomenon we studied extensively at Dahlgren. We called it position-induced angular deviation. It's not about the weapon or the shooter. It's about the geometric relationship between the shooting platform and the target array." Sergeant Mitchell stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "With respect, sir, I've been shooting for 20 years. I've never heard of anything like this. That's because most ranges are designed with this principle in mind, even if the designers don't consciously think about it," Frank explained. "When you moved the firing line, you inadvertently created a geometry that looks correct but introduces systematic error. Your weapons are zeroed for a straight line to the target, but your actual firing position creates a slight angular offset." Captain Reeves was processing this rapidly. "So when Holloway moved back to the old position, he returned to the geometric relationship that his zero was actually calibrated for," Frank finished. The angle between his position and the target matched the angle his scope compensation was set for. "But we've been shooting from these new positions for 3 weeks," Corporal Chen interjected. "Why didn't anyone notice this during the range modification?" "Because," Frank said, "whoever approved the modifications probably tested them at shorter ranges, 200, maybe 300 yards. At those distances, the error is minimal, maybe an inch or two. Easy to attribute to normal shooting variance. It's only at extended ranges that the geometric error becomes significant enough to cause consistent misses." The explanation hung in the air as the Marines absorbed its implications. 3 weeks of frustration, countless hours of troubleshooting, their deployment hanging in the balance, all because someone had moved the firing line 15 feet without understanding the geometric consequences. Captain Reeves felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief that the problem was identified and solvable. Anger that such a simple oversight had nearly destroyed her unit's readiness. "So what's the solution?" she asked Frank. "You have 3 options," he replied, ticking them off on his fingers. 1. Move the firing positions back to where they were originally. 2. Move the target array to compensate for the new geometry. 3. Calculate the exact angular deviation and adjust each rifle's 0 to account for it. The third option sounds complicated. It is, and it's weapon-specific, which means every time someone picks up a different rifle, they'd need individualized adjustments. Options 1 or 2 are simpler and more reliable. Marcus had been listening intently, his mind racing through the implications. "Sir, if I may ask, how did you spot this?" "I mean, you watched us shoot for maybe 10 minutes before figuring it out." Frank smiled slightly. "During Vietnam, I worked with SEAL snipers who were taking shots from boats, moving platforms, unstable positions. We learned that consistency in shooting isn't just about the fundamentals. It's about understanding the complete system. The shooter, the weapon, the platform, the target, and the geometric relationship between all of them. When I saw your positions had been moved and you'd been experiencing problems for the exact amount of time since that modification, it was the first variable I wanted to test. But you knew what to look for," Captain Reeves said. "You recognized something none of us saw." "I had different training," Frank acknowledged. "At Dahlgren, we approached shooting as an engineering problem, not just a marksmanship problem. We studied ballistics, geometry, atmospheric physics. Most military sniper training focuses on the individual shooter's skills, which is important, but sometimes the problem isn't with the shooter at all." Sarah Brennan spoke up, her voice carrying a note of frustration. "So we've been tearing ourselves apart, questioning our abilities, thinking we'd somehow forgotten how to shoot, and the whole time it was just that someone moved the firing line a few feet." "That's exactly right," Frank said gently. "And that's why I wanted to come observe. Sometimes an outside perspective can see what those closest to the problem can't. You were all so focused on your individual performance that no one stepped back to question the system itself." Captain Reeves pulled out her phone and quickly dialed Lieutenant Colonel Barker's number. When he answered, she spoke rapidly. "So we've identified the problem with the sniper team. It's the range modification from 3 weeks ago. We need authorization to either restore the original firing positions or relocate the targets. I can have the team back to full qualification standards within 48 hours. There was a pause as Barker processed this information. "You're certain?" "Yes, sir. We've already conducted a test that confirms the diagnosis. I have an expert consultant on site who can explain the technical details if needed. I'll have the range officer contact you within the hour." "Get it fixed, Captain." As she ended the call, the Marines on the line were already discussing the revelation among themselves, the relief palpable. 3 weeks of doubt and frustration were evaporating, replaced by a renewed confidence. Frank began packing up his notebook, preparing to leave, but Marcus approached him. "Sir, that thing you mentioned about shooting from boats, is that something you could teach? I mean, we do maritime operations sometimes, and shooting from unstable platforms has always been challenging." Frank finished with a knowing smile. It's a completely different skill set. The fundamentals matter, but you also need to understand motion prediction, timing, and how to use the platform's movement rather than fighting against it. Captain Reeves overheard this exchange and made a decision. Mr. Dietrich, Frank, would you be willing to spend some time with my team? Share some of that specialized knowledge? I have a feeling there's a lot we could learn from your experience. Frank looked at the assembled Marines, seeing in their faces the same hunger for knowledge he'd seen in young SEALs 4 decades earlier. Despite the grey hair and the years, he felt that old familiar pull, the desire to pass on hard-won lessons to the next generation. I think that could be arranged, he said. 2 days later, the range had been restored to its original configuration. The firing positions were back where they'd been, and Scout Sniper Team 3 had completed a full qualification shoot with a 94% hit rate, well above the required standard. Their deployment was back on track, the crisis averted. But Captain Reeves hadn't forgotten her invitation to Frank, and neither had the team. On a cool Saturday morning, with no official training scheduled, 11 of the 12 team members voluntarily showed up at the range to find Frank Dietrich already there. Setting up equipment that looked nothing like standard Marine Corps issue, he'd brought several long cases, a portable whiteboard, and what appeared to be a small boat motor mounted on a metal frame. Marcus and Robert Mitchell exchanged curious glances as they approached. "Good morning," Frank called out. "Thank you for giving up your weekend. What I'm going to share with you today isn't in any manual you've read. Some of it might contradict what you've been taught. I'm not here to replace your training, just to add tools to your toolbox." The Marines gathered around as Frank opened one of the cases, revealing an old bolt-action rifle that looked like it had seen decades of hard use. The wood stock was worn smooth, the bluing on the barrel faded and scratched. "This is a Remington 700 in .308 Winchester," Frank said, lifting it carefully. "I've owned this rifle since 1974. It's not tactical, it's not modern, and it doesn't have any of the bells and whistles your weapons have. But I've made shots with this rifle that people said were impossible." He handed it to Sarah Brennan, who examined it with the respect due any well-used tool. The rifle was heavier than she expected, the action worn but smooth. "The first lesson I want to share," Frank continued, "is about adaptability. Modern military doctrine emphasizes standardization, same weapons, same optics, same techniques. That's efficient for training large numbers of people. But real-world shooting conditions are rarely standard." He gestured to the boat motor on the frame. During the Mekong operations, SEAL snipers often had to engage targets from moving riverboats. The platforms were unstable, the timing was critical, and there was no such thing as a perfect shooting position. They had to learn to work with the motion instead of against it. Frank activated the motor, and the frame began to rock back and forth in a slow, rhythmic pattern that mimicked the movement of a boat on water. He set up a shooting mat on the frame and gestured to Corporal Chen. "Danny, you mentioned maritime operations. Come up here and show me your shooting position." Chen climbed onto the rocking platform and immediately struggled to establish a stable prone position. The continuous movement threw off his balance, making it nearly impossible to acquire a steady sight picture. After 30 seconds of trying, he looked up at Frank with frustration. "Can't get stable, sir. The movement's too constant." "Exactly," Frank said. "Now let me show you something different." He climbed onto the platform himself, and despite his age, moved with surprising fluidity. Instead of fighting the rocking motion, he seemed to flow with it. His body relaxed rather than rigid. The mistake most shooters make on unstable platforms is trying to force stability. They tense up, try to muscle through it, but tension amplifies instability. He demonstrated, his body moving in sync with the platform's rhythm. Instead, you relax into the motion. Learn its pattern. A boat rocks in predictable cycles, forward, back, left, right. Once you understand the rhythm, you time your shot for the moment of maximum stability, which occurs at the peak of each swing. He picked up his old rifle and chambered a round. The Marines watched as he swayed with the platform, seemingly effortless. Then at what appeared to be a random moment, he fired. Downrange at 300 yards, the target showed a clean hit. "That's just timing and practice," Frank said, climbing down. "Each of you try it. Don't expect perfection. Expect to learn the feeling." Over the next hour, each Marine took turns on the moving platform. It was humbling work. These were elite shooters, capable of incredible precision under normal conditions, but the rocking platform reduced them to beginners. Yet slowly they began to understand what Frank was teaching, not rigid control, but fluid adaptation. Marcus found himself thinking differently about shooting fundamentals. Everything he'd been taught emphasized stability, consistency, elimination of variables. Frank was teaching the opposite: how to work within chaos, how to find success in imperfect conditions. "The second lesson," Frank said during a break, "is about environmental awareness beyond the basics." He pulled out a large aerial photograph of a Middle Eastern urban area and spread it on the table. "You've all been trained to read wind, adjust for distance, account for temperature, good. But have you been taught to read urban heat patterns?" The Marines exchanged uncertain glances. Frank pointed to different areas of the photograph. "Cities create microclimates. The streets heat up differently than the buildings. Glass facades reflect heat. Metal roofs absorb it. All of this creates thermal currents that affect bullet trajectory in ways that standard wind reading won't predict." He pulled out another photograph, this one showing a dense urban street. "Let's say you're on a rooftop here, engaging a target 600 yards away through this street canyon. Your wind flags show a left-to-right crosswind at 5 miles per hour. Do you adjust for 5 miles per hour?" "Yes, sir," several Marines answered automatically. "Wrong. The street canyon creates a venturi effect. The wind accelerates as it's channeled between buildings. That 5-mile-per-hour wind might be hitting 8 or 9 miles per hour in the actual bullet path. Plus, if one side of the street is in shadow and the other in sunlight, you've got thermal currents pushing the bullet vertically." Robert Mitchell leaned forward, intrigued. "How do you calculate all that in a combat situation?" "You don't calculate it, you read it," Frank replied. "And you read it by observing indicators most people overlook. Flags and banners at different heights tell you about vertical wind variation. Dust patterns show you where air is being channeled. Heat shimmer reveals thermal currents. Birds and insects avoid strong updrafts. Watch where they fly." He spent the next 30 minutes teaching them to read environmental signs they'd never considered: the way trash moved in gutters, how smoke behaved in different thermal conditions, the subtle indicators that revealed the true complexity of the atmosphere their bullets were traveling through. Sarah raised her hand. "Sir, this is incredible information, but how did you learn all this?" "I mean, none of this is in our training pipeline." Frank was quiet for a moment, his expression distant. "Vietnam was a laboratory for unconventional warfare. The snipers I worked with were taking shots in jungles, from helicopters, across rivers, through urban environments that changed daily. Standard doctrine didn't cover half of what they faced. So we experimented, documented what worked, shared knowledge across units." He pulled out an old, weathered notebook, not the one he'd been using at the range, but something older, its pages yellowed and filled with handwritten notes and diagrams. "This was my field journal. Everything I learned, I wrote down. Observations, measurements, techniques that worked, techniques that failed. When I got to Dahlgren, we formalized some of it, but most of this knowledge never made it into official doctrine." Marcus looked at the journal with reverence. It represented decades of hard-won experience, lessons learned in conditions where mistakes had lethal consequences. "The third lesson," Frank continued, "is about decision-making under imperfect information." He set up a scenario on the whiteboard. "You're deployed. Your team receives intelligence about a high-value target appearing at a specific location in 4 hours. You set up a hide site 900 yards from the expected position. You wait. But when the target appears, He's not where intelligence said he'd be. He's 150 yards further and 30 degrees off angle. Your shot window is 15 seconds before he disappears into a building. What do you do? Adjust and take the shot, Chen answered immediately. Using what data? You haven't ranged that exact position. Your dope card is calculated for 900 yards, not 1,050. The angle is different than you practiced. How confident are you in your holdover calculations? The question hung in the air. This was the kind of scenario that didn't have a clean answer. The kind that training could prepare you for, but never fully simulate. In 1971, Frank said quietly, I watched a SEAL sniper face exactly this situation. He had one shot at a North Vietnamese officer who'd been coordinating attacks on river patrols. The target appeared in an unexpected location. The sniper had to estimate distance, wind, and angle in about 10 seconds. He made the shot, Frank paused. He made it because he'd trained himself to think in probabilities rather than certainties. He couldn't know the exact range, so he estimated a range bracket between 950 and 100 yards. He couldn't measure the wind at the target, so he observed indicators and estimated a range of probable wind speeds. Then he calculated a shot that would be effective anywhere within those probability brackets. He drew a diagram showing overlapping circles of uncertainty. Perfect accuracy wasn't possible given the time constraint, but effective accuracy was. He aimed for the center of the probability zone and trusted his fundamentals. The shot connected not because he had perfect information, but because he'd trained himself to make sound tactical decisions with imperfect information. The Marines were silent, absorbing this different way of thinking about precision shooting. They'd been trained to seek certainty, to verify every variable. Frank was teaching them how to operate when certainty wasn't available. As the sun climbed higher and the morning grew warmer, Frank continued sharing lessons that had never made it into official manuals. He taught them about reading mirage at extreme distances, about using natural sounds to judge wind speed, about the psychological aspects of patience and timing that separated good snipers from exceptional ones. By noon, when they finally broke for lunch, each Marine had filled pages of notes with techniques and observations they'd never encountered in formal training. But more than the specific techniques, Frank had given them something more valuable, a different framework for thinking about their craft. Captain Reeves had arrived mid-morning to observe. As the team dispersed for lunch, she approached Frank. That was remarkable. Where did you say you learned all this? Some of it in Vietnam, some at Dahlgren, some just from 50 years of paying attention, Frank replied. But here's the thing, Captain. Your Marines already have the foundation to be exceptional. They've got the discipline, the fundamentals, the dedication. What I'm sharing is just refinement, ways to think beyond the standard doctrine when situations demand it. Would you be willing to put some of this into a more formal training program? What you're teaching could benefit a lot more shooters than just my team, Frank smiled. Maybe, but some knowledge transfers best person to person, not through manuals. These Marines will remember today because they experienced it, struggled with it, internalized it. That's worth more than any written doctrine. As the team reassembled for the afternoon session, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since his first days in sniper school, the excitement of discovering entirely new dimensions to a skill he thought he'd mastered. Frank Dietrich had opened doors he didn't know existed, and beyond those doors lay a deeper understanding of the craft that defined him as a Marine. The old Navy veteran had more to teach, and they were eager to learn. 3 weeks after Frank's Saturday training session, Scout Sniper Team 3 deployed to their assignment in the Middle East. The flight was long, the landscape harsh and unforgiving, but the Marines carried with them more than just their equipment. They carried lessons from a different era of warfare, adapted for modern application. Their base of operations was a fortified compound outside a city that had seen its share of conflict. The mission was straightforward on paper: provide overwatch for convoy operations and eliminate high-value targets when opportunities presented themselves. In reality, nothing about combat operations was ever straightforward. Marcus found himself on a rooftop position on their fourth day in country. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, creating the exact kind of thermal patterns Frank had described. Between his position and the street below, heat shimmer rose in visible waves. Using traditional methods, the distortion would have made accurate range estimation nearly impossible, but Marcus found himself looking at the scene differently now. He watched how the heat shimmer behaved, noting where it was strongest and where it dissipated. He observed the way dust moved along the street, channeled by the building facades. A piece of torn fabric hanging from a balcony 300 yards away showed him wind direction at mid-level, while trash skittering along the ground revealed surface-level air movement. Got eyes on two suspicious individuals, northeast corner, his spotter. Corporal Chen reported through the radio. Range approximately 550 yards. Marcus studied the position. The targets were in shadow, while the street between them was in full sunlight, a temperature differential of at least 30 degrees. Frank's lessons about thermal currents came flooding back. The heated air rising from the sunlit street would push the bullet upward as it passed through that thermal layer. "I see them," Marcus confirmed, acquiring the position through his scope. "Stand by." The individuals were carrying what appeared to be improvised explosive device components, moving with the nervous awareness of people engaged in something illicit. The rules of engagement were clear. If they began assembling a device that threatened coalition forces, they were legitimate targets. Marcus made his calculations, but instead of relying solely on his ballistic computer, he incorporated the environmental reading techniques Frank had taught. The standard dope would put him center mass at 550 yards. But accounting for the thermal updraft from the heated street, he needed to hold slightly lower, perhaps 4 inches. "They're pulling out components," Chen reported urgently. "Assembly in progress. Time compressed." Marcus controlled his breathing, felt his heartbeat slow. The fundamentals were still there, everything the Marine Corps had taught him, but layered over them was this new understanding of the environment as a living, dynamic system. The shot broke clean. Through the scope, he watched the target drop. The second individual fled, disappearing into an alley before a follow-up shot was possible. But the immediate threat was neutralized. "Good hit," Chen confirmed. "EOD team is moving to secure the device." Later, during the after-action review, the team commander noted the thermal conditions and the difficulty of the shot. Marcus mentioned Frank's training about reading urban heat patterns, and several other team members chimed in with their own applications of the techniques they'd learned. Captain Reeves, who was monitoring the radio traffic from the Tactical Operations Center, felt a deep sense of gratitude. The knowledge Frank had shared wasn't just theoretical, it was keeping her Marines safe and making them more effective. Halfway through the deployment, the team faced a situation that truly tested everything they'd learned. Intelligence reported a high-value target would be moving through a specific sector, but the timing was uncertain and the exact route unknown. The team had to establish a hide site that could cover multiple possible positions across a wide area. Sarah Brennan found herself as the primary shooter, with Robert Mitchell as her spotter. They'd been in position for 6 hours when Mitchell spotted movement. "Possible target, 11 o'clock, 780 yards, he whispered. Sarah acquired the position. The target was indeed the individual from the intelligence photos, but he wasn't where they'd expected. He was further away, at a different angle, and their window of opportunity was measured in seconds, not minutes. This was Frank's scenario, the one he'd described about the SEAL sniper in Vietnam. Imperfect information, time pressure, and a target that wouldn't wait for perfect calculations. Sarah's mind worked rapidly. She couldn't precisely range the new position, so she estimated a bracket between 760 and 800 yards. The wind had shifted since they'd last checked, but watching the movement of leaves on a distant tree gave her an estimate, 7 to 9 miles per hour. Quartering from the left, She didn't have time for perfect certainty, but she had enough information for a probability calculation. She adjusted her hold to account for the middle of her estimated ranges, trusted her fundamentals, and when the target paused for just a moment, she took the shot. "Hit," Mitchell confirmed. "Target down." The engagement was over in less than 15 seconds from initial acquisition to shot. In the debrief later, Sarah explained her decision-making process, describing how Frank's lessons about operating with imperfect information had given her the confidence to make the shot despite the uncertainties. "That's exactly the kind of adaptive thinking we need," Captain Reeves told her. "You made a sound tactical decision based on the information available. That's the mark of an exceptional sniper." As the deployment progressed, other team members found applications for Frank's unconventional wisdom. When conducting operations from helicopter platforms, Marcus used the techniques for shooting, from moving boats, adapting them to a different environment but applying the same principles, of reading motion patterns and timing shots to moments of relative stability during a mission that required shooting across a wide river valley. Corporal Chen applied Frank's lessons about reading environmental indicators. By observing how birds were flying and where insects congregated, he identified thermal currents and wind patterns that his instruments alone wouldn't have revealed. His shots connected consistently, despite conditions that would have challenged traditional methods. The team's success rate throughout the deployment was exceptional. They completed every assigned mission, neutralized multiple high-value targets, and most importantly, every Marine came home safely. 3 months later, back at Camp Pendleton, the team gathered for their post-deployment debrief. Lieutenant Colonel Barker personally attended, along with representatives from the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School. The team's performance had attracted attention, particularly their innovative approaches to environmental reading and adaptive shooting techniques. Captain Reeves had invited Frank to attend, though she'd kept his presence as a surprise for the team. When the Marines filed into the briefing room and saw the old Navy veterans sitting in the back row, their faces lit up with genuine pleasure. After the official portions of the debrief concluded, Barker asked Frank to come forward. "Mr. Dietrich, Captain Reeves has briefed me extensively on the training you provided this team. The techniques you shared demonstrably improved their operational effectiveness. On behalf of the United States Marine Corps, I want to thank you for your service and for passing on your knowledge to the next generation." Frank stood, somewhat embarrassed by the attention. "Colonel, these Marines did the hard work. I just shared some observations from my time in service. They took those lessons and applied them in ways I never could have imagined." Marcus stood up. "Sir, with respect, it was more than that. You taught us to think differently, not to replace our training, but to see beyond it. That made all the difference." "Holloway's right," Sarah added. "There were multiple instances downrange where we faced situations our standard training hadn't fully prepared us for. The tools you gave us, the framework for thinking about shooting as a complete system, not just individual techniques, that's what got us through." Frank looked at the assembled Marines, seeing in their eyes the satisfaction that comes from hard-earned competence. "If I could share one final thought," he said, "it's this: knowledge shouldn't be hoarded or lost. Every generation of warriors faces new challenges, but the fundamental principles of adaptation, observation, and sound decision-making remain constant. What I learned in Vietnam, what these Marines learned in the Middle East, it's all part of a continuum. Pass it forward. Teach the next generation. Don't let hard-won lessons die with the people who learned them." Captain Reeves approached Frank after the formal briefing ended. "The Scout Sniper School wants to incorporate some of your techniques into their curriculum. They're asking if you'd be willing to consult on updating their training materials." Frank smiled. "I'm 68 years old, Captain. I'm not sure I'm the right person to be writing doctrine for the modern Marine Corps." "You're exactly the right person," she countered. "Not to write it alone, but to work with current instructors. Blend your experience with their expertise. That's how knowledge evolves, by connecting generations." Over the following months, Frank did exactly that. He worked with Marine Scout sniper instructors, sharing techniques from his decades of experience while learning about modern technologies and methods. The result was a training module that bridged eras, combining time-tested principles of environmental awareness and adaptive thinking with contemporary tools and doctrine. The module became known informally as the Dietrich Protocols, though Frank himself objected to the name. "It's not my knowledge," he insisted. "It belongs to every shooter who figured something out under pressure and took the time to document it. I'm just the guy who wrote some of it down and shared it forward." But to Scout Sniper Team 3 and to the hundreds of Marine snipers who would train using those methods in the years that followed, Frank Dietrich represented something important: the bridge between generations of warriors. The living proof that knowledge earned in one war could save lives in the next. On a crisp autumn morning, almost a year after that first crisis on the range, Frank stood once again at Camp Pendleton. But this time, he wasn't there to solve a problem. He was there to watch a new class of Marine Scout snipers graduate, many of whom had trained using techniques he'd helped develop. Marcus, now promoted to gunnery sergeant, stood beside him. "You know, sir, there's a lot of young Marines who owe their success to what you taught us. Some of them don't even know your name, but they're using your methods." Frank watched the young Marines receive their Scout Sniper badges, their faces radiating pride and determination. "That's how it should be," he said quietly. "The knowledge matters more than the credit. These kids will face challenges we can't imagine. But if we've given them the tools to think adaptively, to observe carefully, to make sound decisions under pressure, then we've done our job." As the ceremony concluded and the new snipers celebrated with their families, Frank prepared to leave. He'd come full circle, from a young Navy corpsman learning to shoot in the jungles of Vietnam, to a researcher pushing the boundaries of long-range marksmanship, to a retired veteran who'd stumbled into the opportunity to pass forward a lifetime of knowledge. Captain Reeves, now Major Reeves, promoted in recognition of her unit's exceptional deployment performance, walked Frank to his truck. "You changed a lot of lives, Frank. You know that, right?" He smiled, that same quiet smile he'd worn when he first arrived at the range a year ago. "I just helped solve a geometry problem, Major. You and your Marines did everything else. It was more than geometry, and you know it." Frank opened his truck door, then paused. "There's a quote I read once from some ancient warrior tradition. It said, 'The best warriors are the ones who plant trees in whose shade they'll never sit.' I'm just glad I got to plant a few seeds." As he drove away from Camp Pendleton, past the ranges where it had all begun, Frank felt a quiet satisfaction. Somewhere downrange, future Marines would face impossible situations and find solutions using principles he'd helped preserve. The continuum of warrior knowledge, passed from generation to generation, remained unbroken, and that, more than any medal or recognition, was the legacy worth leaving behind. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.